Hey, well, good evening, one and all, and welcome to another in our Conversations on the Catholic Imagination series. Tonight's event is a book discussion based on a recent release from Slant Books, The Relevance of the Stars, Christ, Culture, Destiny, a volume of essays and talks given by the great Monsignor Lorenzo Albacete, bundled in a one-of-a-kind collection. Our event tonight features book editors Lickona and Gregory Wolfe in conversation with Monsignor Albacete's longtime friend, Capuchin Franciscan Friar Seán O'Malley, the Cardinal Archbishop of Boston. We're so delighted to have these three wonderful people here to speak about a fourth, the larger-than-life Lorenzo of blessed memory. Please check out the bios of our esteemed guests on our webpage so that we can conserve time for what promises to be substantive and rousing, because the spirit of Monsignor Albacete certainly will be with us. I'm Michael Murphy, and I direct the Hank Center here at Loyola, and I'm coming to you live from one of our many Loyola outposts here in digital, through the wonders of digital technology. And on behalf of the Hank family, whose generous endowment funds our many endeavors, and on behalf of our office manager, Patty Delgado, our graduate student assistant, Adam High, and our undergraduate intern, Grace, I extend a warm greeting to all on the call tonight. Greg and Lisa will be facilitating tonight's conversation, but I'll be back with you at comment and Q&A time, sharing the insights and questions that our audience enters into the proceedings via the chat function. So with that in mind, just let me give you a couple housekeeping items, as they say, before we begin. First, a note on our format, just kind of hinted at it. The Zoom, it's a meeting, so the chat is in play, but it's kind of clamped down. So you can kind of send a message to all the speakers, but I'd ask you to direct your questions or comments to me, and then I can kind of vet and get to as many of these questions as we can, so that our panel can respond. And I always say, if you think about it, write it down. It keeps it going. It helps me organize as I'm listening along with you, and we'll get there. Number two, if this event were an in-person one, and how I wish it were, we'd be selling books in the back corner. So let's keep that spirit alive in this virtual space. We're gonna put into the chat a link to the Albacete book, The Relevance of the Stars, but we're also going to put a link to all the great titles at Slant Books as well. Greg Wolfe, as you know, or may not know, did all of us an indescribable service in his founding of Image, one of America's leading literary journals, which he edited, founded, blood, sweat, and tears for 30 years. So many on this call owe Greg a debt of gratitude for shepherding conversations in art, faith, and mystery. And these conversations were the ones that Cardinal Seán and Lorenzo got into more than once, and you can see those online as well. So with that, I want to welcome Lisa. Great to meet you. Cardinal Seán, a pleasure to meet you, Your Eminence. And of course, Greg. And Greg, the Zoom stage is now yours, my friend.
Thank you, Mike. It's an honor and a pleasure to once again be a participant in the kind of serious, timely conversations that the Hank Center fosters about the church and the world. And of course, I'm very honored to be present today with my colleagues, Lisa Lickona and His Eminence, Cardinal O'Malley. I just want to say a few quick words by way of framing today's event, because for many in the audience, today's session may be a little bit unusual. It's a book presentation. We're presenting a book. What does that mean? Well, in my experience, this format is much more popular in Europe and Latin America than it is here. But I think it's worth doing for a number of different reasons. We're talking about a man who was, to be honest, briefly famous for a time in the late 90s and in the aughts of this new century, and who is now sadly gone from us. Someone who very few people today know in a direct sense, very well. And the book under discussion is from a small and somewhat obscure publisher. And so we need to do some remedial work to try to bring this man and his legacy forward and into this new century fully, and hence the desire to put the book together and to have this session today. Let me just go over a few of the things I think signify the significance of Lorenzo Albacete for our time and what we hope to touch on during the course of our conversation. The first reason to do an event like this is that Lorenzo himself had absolutely no interest whatsoever in self-promotion. And that's in part why Lisa and I had some hard work to do, because he was a man who was living always in the present moment. Somebody would come to him and ask him to give a talk. He would give a talk, and if we were lucky, he would write it up and in notes with plenty of typos, and he would leave it on his hard drive and never think about it again. He was a man who was always focused on the other and never really gave a thought to putting his work together for publication. Really, people had to come after him to make any of this possible. And this book is one sign of that. Another reason that we're doing this is that Lorenzo Albacete was one of the great all-time characters. And as Mike said, and a larger-than-life personality. And in this case, not just because he was funny and hilarious and free, and he was all of those things, but because his convictions, his deepest beliefs, and his personality were truly mirrors of one another. They were integrated. He wasn't just an academic theologian who happened to be able to tell jokes. His full human personality and his vision were absolutely one and the same. And frankly, he deserves to go down in legend as one of the most amazing people in the American history of the American church. Another reason we want to discuss the significance of Lorenzo Albacete is that in some ways his own witness and life and writings and speeches signify a turning point for the lay movement, communion, and liberation in North America. As many of you may know, this movement was founded by Father Luigi Giussani in the 1950s in Italy. It's been present in the States now for decades, of course, but we've always had a phenomenon in the movement of a language that is very Italian in its rhetorical style and elements, and with many unusual terms. And I think it's really in the work of Lorenzo Albacete that the genius of Father Giussani really finally enters an American idiom in a way that demonstrates its power and its vitality for our culture. But of course, this is precisely an ongoing process. I remember a priest friend of mine, who will go nameless because he's now an archbishop, once said, I think Giussani was an okay guy, but all this language of encounter and event and the heart, I don't know, it sounds a bit touchy-feely to me. And I really had to laugh because he couldn't really have known that this charism is really founded on a vision that's absolutely the opposite of touchy-feely subjectivism. It's in fact about what happens to us when we encounter something outside of ourselves, an other who invades us, who calls us, and that encounter calls us out of ourselves. And yet the language of the movement does need translation, and I think Albacete achieved that in a way that deserves to be much more widely known. He was a man who, I've said, speaks an American idiom. Well, I need to qualify that. He was also a Puerto Rican by birth, a man of Latin culture, and he always, that was central to his identity. And what made him, I think, such an interesting person and such an interesting thinker, he was in many ways an insider in the church. He had the ear of great bishops and archbishops and popes and cardinals. He was a brilliant theologian who was consulted by them all the time, but he was also a man of the people, he was also happiest, I think, when he was with his parishioners, with his fellow members of the movement. And so he was an outsider to American culture. He appreciated it, but brought to it an element of friendly skepticism and affection that I think really gives his work a kind of unique power to speak to those of us who are native. Finally, I would just say, if Monsignor Albacete's vision of the faith really spreads, it will, I think, bring about a great wave of renewal, because I think he speaks to a church that has too often been hampered by moralism and doctrinalism, and too easily lured into the divisive culture wars, and and lacks at times the spirit of positivity, of hope, and of the ability to engage everyone, whether believer or Protestant, Catholic, Jew, Muslim, around the world. That capacity to speak a human language about the deepest things, the religious sense, made him able to communicate with so many people powerfully and enduringly. So I hope that we cover these and other topics as we chat today. And now, to give us just a little bit of background so we know who this man was and how his life evolved, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Lisa Lickona.
Thank you, Greg. I want to start off by just thanking the Hank Center for inviting me. Thank you, Mike, for that beautiful introduction. And I'm so grateful to be here with you, Greg, and also with you, Your Eminence. I'm going to start us off here with a little bio, with a little kind of context for this extraordinary figure, Monsignor Lorenzo Albacete. When we put together the Relevance of the Stars, which is one of the great joys of my life thus far, we realized that Monsignor's background was important. It's important to see these moments in his life, that these turning points that give a lot of insight into his own thought. As Greg said, in Monsignor, there's an amazing unity of his experience and his thought. So I'm gonna just lay out a few of these turning points in his life that ground our discussion here tonight. He was born in Puerto Rico, in San Juan, Puerto Rico, in 1941, and into a loving Catholic family. In fact, he later said that he was born into a culture in which Catholicism was like the air that one breathed. As a young man, he chose to come to Washington, D.C. for graduate studies. And after getting a master's degree in space science and applied physics, he spent several years working at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory in Maryland. And this is where, in the midst of conversations with his colleagues about faith and culture, he starts to discern a call to the priesthood. And in 1974 was ordained a priest for the Archdiocese of Washington, and quickly became a theological advisor to Cardinal William Baum. It was while working for the Cardinal that he had this really decisive encounter with a little-known Polish Cardinal, Karol Wojtyła. And this was a story that Monsignor Albacete told all the time. Beautiful story, because when Wojtyła came to visit the United States, when he came to DC, he was not considered likely to be elected Pope. And when obscure Polish cardinals showed up, they didn't get the red carpet treatment. They got someone like Monsignor Albacete to drive them around town. So he was able to develop this beautiful relationship with Wojtyła, and a friendship was born. And this was really one of the things about Monsignor that I think will be thematic tonight, were these friendships that he developed. He had an incredible capacity for friendship. A few years later, that lowly Polish cardinal becomes Pope. And soon after that, Albacete goes to Rome for graduate studies and actually puts his energy into studying the work of his friend. now Pope John Paul II. So he got a doctorate in with a specialty in the theological anthropology of John Paul II. Came back to the States. He was instrumental in founding the Pope John Paul II Institute in Washington, D.C., and that is actually where I encountered him. I was a student in one of his classes, several of his classes, in the early 90s, and he was a decisive influence and a figure that always had a cluster of students around him. He was there in DC for 9 years, had a year, spent a year in Puerto Rico, returned to Puerto Rico to serve as the president of the Pontifical University of Puerto Rico there, and then came back to New York and took on a post at Dunwoody, St. Joseph's Seminary in New York City. And this was a very interesting point in Monsignor Albacete's life, because he developed at the same time, he developed friendships, unexpected friendships in New York City with people that were really part of the media elite, writers, producers. And once again, it was out of these incredible friendships that new things were born. He wrote, he was invited to write a cover story for the New Yorker. He wrote for the New York Times. He was invited to be on CNN, the Charlie Rose Show. And then there was a lasting friendship with Helen Whitney, who is a producer for PBS and involved him in a lot of her work. And so there were these unexpected friendships that grew up with people that were really outside of the normal track that a Catholic priest would be part of. At the same time, there was this encounter that happened in the 90s with Luigi Giussani that Greg just mentioned. Giussani was someone that Monsignor Albacete met through his friend Angelo Scola. And Giussani was just exploded his world. Up until this point, Monsignor Albacete was a great devotee of the work of Pope John Paul II, continued to be a devotee of John Paul II. But it was as though Giussani had brought a new depth to the work of John Paul II, to his thought. And Giussani was, the encounter with Giussani really answered questions that Monsignor Albacete had had since his early days, questions about faith and culture, how to live the faith in the world today, how could we encounter Christ in the concrete experiences of our life. So the encounter with Giussani exploded his world, and in the year 2000, Father Giussani asked Monsignor Albacete to take a hand in leading the CL community in the US. Now, Monsignor Giussani's work with community liberation had begun in the 50s with a small group of high school students, but by this time, by 2000, it had exploded in a movement in the church. And throughout the country, throughout the US, there were all these little fledgling communities of community liberation. Albacete began crisscrossing the country, visiting these small communities, giving talks, retreats, book presentations, and he quickly became a beloved figure. He spoke repeatedly at the massive cultural festival that the movement has in Rimini, Italy. He was a beloved figure at New York Encounter. And at the same time, he published the single major collection of his writings, God at the Ritz, that we had up until this point, up until we brought the Relevance of the Stars out. And the thing that I think will come out in our conversation tonight, the beautiful thing is how all of these relationships were relevant in his life. They formed him. And certainly when he passed away in 2014, the outpouring of love that came forth at that time from a wide spectrum of figures was evidence of how relevant and how decisive his influence was on was for so many people. At that time, at Monsignor Albacete's funeral, His Eminence Cardinal Seán O'Malley gave the funeral homily. I was very grateful to have the opportunity to be there that day. And I'd love to hand it on to you now, Your Eminence, to share something of your experience with Monsignor.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank everybody for being here tonight. When I was growing up, wherever you visit a house, they always had many Reader's Digests lying around. I don't know how many people read Reader's Digest anymore, but two of the most popular columns that they had, one was Laughter, the Best Medicine, and the other, which is probably the most read part of Reader's Digest, was the column that was the most unforgettable character I ever met. And if I were asked to write for Reader's Digest, I'm sure that I would write about Lorenzo Albacete, because he is not only the most unforgettable, but one of the most lovable characters that I have ever met. I am so grateful to all of you, to Olivetta Danese, to you, Lisa and Greg, for all that you're doing to help more people know the legacy of Father Albacete, who made such an extraordinary contribution during his life. But we have the treasure of his writings and his vision that he shared with so many people. I met him probably in 1968. I was Brother Seán at those days, a seminarian, Capuchin friar, studying at the Capuchin monastery near Catholic University, and working with the Hispanic immigrants at St. Matthew's Cathedral. And Lorenzo, as a young layman, was often very involved in the activities of the cathedral with Monsignor Kuhn and the wonderful staff and people that were there, Rosario Corredera, and so many people that were dear friends of Lorenzo's. And it was there that I first met Lorenzo, and where Lorenzo first met Cardinal O'Malley, who was eventually the prelate who received him into the seminary. But typical of Lorenzo, he arrived at the cathedral one evening and there wasn't any parking, so he parked in the Cardinal's parking space, of course. And before he could get out of the car, Cardinal O'Boyle's car pulled up behind him, and the Cardinal got out and went over and rapped on the window. Lorenzo lowers the window and he said, "Who are you?" The Cardinal was sort of a curmudgeon. He was a wonderful prelate, but he was, he could be tough. And Lorenzo very calmly said, "I'm the Cardinal." And Cardinal O'Boyle said, "I'm the Cardinal." And Lorenzo said, "Yes." He said, "You're the daytime Cardinal." He says, "But I'm the nighttime Cardinal." And with that began an extraordinary friendship between Lorenzo Albacete and Cardinal O'Boyle. Those were challenging days in the church. We were in that period of great upheaval after the Second Vatican Council, and there was a lot of polarization in the church. I mean, sometimes, we look back on this golden age that really never existed. We had our crosses and conflicts and problems in those days. And but Lorenzo was a master at being able to speak with everybody and listen to everybody. Pope Francis has called for this synod on synodality, which is about encountering people, listening with the heart, in an atmosphere of prayer and discernment to discover God's will for us individually and for the church. That is something that was part and parcel of the life and personality and charism of Lorenzo Albacete. He had such a great capacity to listen. He was, slow to judge, slow to anger. And as the Spanish talk about someone who has don de gente, the gift of people, he had a gift for relationships that was just extraordinary. And he was not intimidated by grandeur or wealth or power, and nor was he put off by weakness, sinfulness, or whatever debility a human being might have. He could be friend to presidents and janitors, to popes and waitresses at the IHOP, where he would take me at 1 o'clock in the morning for chocolate chip pancakes and conversation about what was happening at the John Paul II Institute. People would see him tall and blonde and fair and say, "You don't look Puerto Rican." And he would always get a kick out of that, because there was no one who was more Puerto Rican than Lorenzo Albacete. His love for Santurce, for Sagrado Corazon, his parish and the colegio where he had studied, for his family, his friends, his classmates, his devotion to his mom, Conchita, and his sister, Manolo, was just extraordinary. And of course, we all delighted in his sense of humor, in his sense of the absurd. He was also a very, very cultured person. And one of my joys for many decades was I had specialized in Spanish and Portuguese literature at Catholic University. And Lorenzo and I would try and read the same books and then call each other late at night and comment on the different purple patches that we would find in these books. And sometimes when we would meet, we would only have to say a little phrase, and it would put us into hysterical laughter, because we had a way of communicating about the literature that we studied together. It was wonderful. He was often a very irreverent observer of human nature, but he was deeply compassionate. He was the most non-judgmental person that I have ever met in my life, which allowed him to enter into a deep and profound dialogue with contemporary intellectuals and personalities from the media. And he was so non-threatening and open to people that it caused people to come to him and open their hearts to him. He was a great spiritual mentor to so many. At the same time, he was a man of very deep faith. And I often think of that book that Austin Ivory came out with a few years ago when he started Catholic Voices, called How to Defend the Faith Without Raising Your Voice. I mean, we're living in an age now where there's so much shouting going on. People are always yelling at each other. Lorenzo not only didn't raise his voice, but he would have everybody laughing and eating out of his hand, because he knew how to express the truths of the faith in a fascinating way that allowed people to look again with new eyes at what the church was teaching, and to discover that it wasn't as superficial or as goofy as they thought before, and they discovered the beauty of the church's teaching. His personality and intellectual acumen helped many people, many naysayers, to come to embrace the faith, or at least to appreciate the beauty and the complexity of the Catholic worldview. Certainly, his trajectory, as I say, in those early days after the council, when there was such effervescence around so many issues in the church. Lorenzo was involved with Triumph Magazine, Brent Bozell, who was Bill Buckley's brother-in-law. But it was really Cardinal Baum that allowed Lorenzo to enter into the world of theology. And his friendship with John Paul II and Pope Benedict and later Don Giussani were such a gift to Lorenzo and enriched his thought, and he was also a genius at being able to explain the vision of John Paul II, his anthropology, the theology of the body, and his involvement in the foundation of the John Paul II Institute was such an important turning point in his life. And in those days, Monsignor Caffarra, later Cardinal Caffarra, would come to Washington for meetings. And of course, Cardinal Scola was also very involved in setting up the John Paul II Institute. I always share the story about at one point, the Holy Father asked Lorenzo to come and give him some ideas about the structure of the Institute and so forth. And Lorenzo showed up in the apostolic apartments, and he was there with a very pious theologian from Opus Dei, who was in his cassock and carrying a beautiful folder with a very carefully typed document to present his recommendations to the Holy Father. And of course, Lorenzo was there in his rabbi that probably had about 2 weeks menu on it. And after the Opus Dei priest made his presentation, which he began by saying, "Your Holiness, I did not sleep last night, knowing that I was going to be in the presence of the Vicar of Christ this morning with the responsibility of sharing these thoughts." So, of course, Lorenzo, when he began his talk to the Holy Father, he said, "Your Holiness," he said, "I slept very well last night. I just want you to know that." And then he pulls out this big envelope that he had scribbled things on. And he said, "Actually, this envelope came from the Riggs Bank." He said, "I had an overdraft in my checking account." And they sent me a notice. And then, of course, made an extraordinarily brilliant presentation of his ideas. When I heard about this, it put me in mind of when Thomas Aquinas and St. Bonaventure were called before, I guess it was Pope Urban, to present their hymns for Corpus Christi. And when Thomas Aquinas presented the Ponte Lingua and all of the other beautiful hymns and prayers that he had written, they looked over at St. Bonaventure, and he just ripped his hymns up. But Lorenzo, in that wonderful friendship he had with the Holy Father, found such a joy and strength. And of course, you had mentioned his going to the Pontifical University in Ponce. We were all very pleased when he was given that post. And I remember going down for his installation ceremony, and so many of his friends and family and all of the bishops of Puerto Rico and some other bishops from outside of Puerto Rico were gathered there. And Lorenzo appeared on the stage wearing the academic robes for the university, which is dedicated to our Blessed Mother. And so it was sort of a powder blue gown with royal blue velvet stripes on it, and this little bonnet with a gold tassel, and he's holding something that looked like a scepter. And I was standing next to him, and he whispered to me, he said, well, if this doesn't pan out, he said, I can always get a job with Walter Mercado. Walter Mercado was a TV psychic with a kind of Liberace-esque flamboyance in his dress, wigs, and jewelry that he wore. Unfortunately, his words proved to be prophetic because things did not work out at the university, and that was a very sad moment for those of us who loved him and supported him. But we were happy that he didn't turn to Walter Mercado looking for a job. But eventually, as we say, God always brings good out of evil. That door closed, another opened, where he went to Dunwoody, which also was a meteoric career. But it did give him the opportunity to encounter the thought and eventually the person of Don Giussani, and that was so mutually beneficial. It really allowed Lorenzo to find his intellectual home, and it also allowed CL to grow in the United States. And so often movements coming from Europe that had grown so fast in European churches really struggled in the United States. This is true of, I think, all of the apostolic movements. But Lorenzo was perfectly positioned to be able to introduce the CL into a whole generation of Catholics and young priests who became very, very involved. And the annual retreats that he gave to the priests were such an important aspect of his ministry. Once again, his deep humanity and spirituality allowed people to open up to him and to be able to tap into his wisdom. And so we're so grateful to Lisa and Greg for having produced this wonderful book, and we're anxious to hear some of their thoughts about it. I always would tease Lorenzo. He was born on January the 7th, and of course, in Puerto Rico, Christmas is really celebrated in Los Reyes, the feast of the kings, the Epiphany. And he arrived one day late, but he was often late for things, so that was not surprising. But the Epiphany is graced by the star of Bethlehem, that led the Magi. And that star that led Lorenzo during his whole life was his deep, abiding faith and love for Jesus Christ and the Catholic Church. And so I am just so grateful to all of you who are helping to pass on this legacy and help people to discover the richness of this man who has been a gift to the Catholic Church and a gift to the priesthood. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Eminence. to bridge us over to a discussion of some of the major themes of Monsignor Albacete's thought, I thought it might be intriguing just to pause briefly to consider both the human and the larger theological ramifications of the encounter with Father Giussani, because it really always struck me that there was a great human drama here. And I think, as His Eminence has suggested, Monsignor Albacete was someone who was succeeding in many ways in the world, but hadn't quite found the right ultimate place. And he was someone who had the ear of popes and cardinals, and yet there was kind of a longing that that was probably still there. I always wondered what he really felt about this major jag in a life. In his mid-50s, he encounters this thinker, and the entire course of the next 20 years of his life changes. And I finally found a passage where he really does reveal a kind of human response, and it's so typically Albacetean that I just have to indulge myself by reading it. We quote it in the introduction to the book, but I found it in an obscure talk he gave to other people in the movement. I think a very casual moment when he felt free to be able to speak honestly to people. He said, "I am proud to consider myself a son of Father Giussani, but making me find this towards the end of my life, I began to be even a little bit angry. The removal, the setting aside of whatever theological knowledge I had in order to try out what Father Giussani was trying to teach me was done because I knew that it was a fuller knowledge. I set this anger aside because this path led to amazement, and for other reasons, it included the heart, the desires of the heart. The decision to try that out was a costly decision, but it was a decision that I made willingly." And here's this quintessentially Albacetean moment. "Why?" he asks. "Because I am very saintly?" No, because what is at stake is my ass, the future of my ass. And for me, this just was a moment of real drama and honesty and beauty. Sometimes this kind of experience of vocation happens in ways that aren't necessarily pretty, that can be profoundly disruptive, and yet at the same time liberating. So as we now try to talk about at least some of the major themes that Monsignor Albacete adumbrated with such grace and wit, I don't know if the Cardinal is still available to us, but one question we have is what are these gifts that he was able to bring to the present moment? We've talked a bit about a church that is very in the midst of a kind of very divisive moment where it seems like in order to be serious about our faith, we have to pick sides and stigmatize the other side and really talk in extremes that everything is the apocalypse. And the spirit of serenity and of calmness and of listening that Monsignor Albacete had seems to be very much an antidote to that. Your Eminence, do you agree with that?
Well, that's why I, talked about Pope Francis's ideal of synodality. I think Lorenzo expresses that so well. Some people think synodality means meetings about meetings. No, it means being on a path with others in dialogue and prayer to discern God's will for our future. And this is the kind of life and vision that Lorenzo had. He was not afraid to take on difficult issues and talk about them, but it was never done in the spirit of the culture wars or attacking people or trying to best people, but rather to discover the truth together and to rejoice in doing that together and discerning God's will. So I think that as we hear so much about synodality today and so many questions are raised, I like to hold up Lorenzo as a wonderful example of what Pope Francis is trying to achieve.
Beautiful, thank you.
I'd love to jump in there on that, because I agree with you, Your Eminence. When I heard about Pope Francis calling for synodality, the first person that popped into my head was Lorenzo Albacete. And, I'd like to say a few things about that, kind of in relationship to the themes of the book, because I think it's very easy to look at someone like Monsignor Albacete and say, well, it was really for him, it was just all about being a really good listener and tuning in and, meeting people where they're at. But I think there was actually something maybe even more profound going on with him. And I have to say, every time I read this book again, and of course, in the course of editing it, you go through it many, many, many times. I am challenged and converted by his approach. And so I want to say something about that right now. I mentioned in the little bio I gave that Monsignor had this incredible capacity for friendship, and you brought that out too, Your Eminence. And a lot of the friendships were with the most unlikely people, and certainly the friendships that he developed with what I would consider the media elites in New York City fit in that camp. And I think there's a beautiful story in the book that illustrates his capacity for friendship. He was invited to a party with a group of these people, and at the party they all sat and watched a documentary, and the documentary was about a British writer who was suffering from a terminal illness. And it really documents kind of his final days, how he struggles to finish one of his great piece of work despite his suffering. And at the end of watching this documentary, everybody present was sitting there talking about how they were just blown away at this man's courage, his capacity for perseverance at the end of his life in the face of this terminal illness. And the hostess turned to Monsignor and so, what do you think? What do you think about this movie that we just watched? And I'm going to read a little bit from actually what Monsignor says here, because it says a lot about who he was. He turns to them and he tells them, as he says, to their amazement, that he was in fact very sad. I was very sad, very depressed by what I saw. So everybody there was amazed, and he was depressed. They asked, how could it be? This man's attitude to life and death was inspiring, heroic, an example to us, of all of us, of spiritual maturity, they insisted. I said, well, maybe, but in the end, he's dead. He's gone. I am sad at that. I am depressed that for all this spiritual strength and heroism, he's gone. I will never be able to meet this man. I miss him. For Monsignor, he prefaced this by saying, before he spoke, he said, I decided to take seriously my own advice. And this is the important point. Listen to your heart. Do not ignore anything. Be attentive to reality. I mean, that's a son of Giussani there, if I ever heard one. But that expresses what Monsignor was about, which was going all the way to the depth of where the human heart is. And in any given situation, there was always this desire in him to get to the bottom of what the heart was really all about. Now, in this situation, that was extremely risky. I mean, he was there, he was kind of the token Catholic priest. He would joke about this, I was the token Catholic priest in the room. And when people turned to him, what was expected was some inspiring words, something that would lift everybody up. But he wasn't going to do that. He was going to go to where he really was. There was this desire to risk his heart in front of other people. And this was this was classic. This was part of his personality, but also part of his theology, right? Because the human heart longs for the infinite. And the only way that we can discover this longing is by being completely straightforward and truthful with the way that we're actually made, with what we're actually experiencing. And I think that that's really kind of brings us to the heart of the whole issue of dualism in the culture, right? Because we're tempted if we're religious people to give religious answers. And yet what is really required is to go to the bottom of our hearts, because there is this thrust, this desire for God. It's inside of us, and it's something that we can trust. And this was the thing that you always had the sense with Monsignor Albacete, that he had complete and total trust in the kind of trajectory of the way God had made him. I mean, he really was, he really exemplified that restless heart of Augustine, that he was going to let his heart come all the way out, and that heart had an answer in the person of Jesus Christ. So I think that for me, like the idea of being present to others that we saw in Monsignor Albacete, I mean, it was something like what Giussani called a presence. He had a capacity to live his humanity in front of other people, and whether they were religious or not, it was attractive. It was disarming. It made you feel free to be who you were and to live your humanity, and that's really what gets you on the path to Christ.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And I think at the heart of dualism was Monsignor Albacete's recognition that the incarnation is the ultimate model for us. It's the perfect balance of these aspects of the human person, the flesh and the spirit, justice and mercy, heaven and earth. And part of the reason that we live in a world of culture wars and dualism is that we tend to separate these things, and we tend to think we pick one side, and we can characterize the right in different ways. It tends to emphasize justice, and the left mercy, and you can go down the line with that. I don't want to bog us down, but I really think that wholeness, that unity, that incarnational unity was at the heart of his vision. And I think it's, of course, easy when we talk about synodality to mock the idea of dialogue, because dialogue is people just shooting off their mouth and saying whatever they want and nothing will ever happen. But it's important to remember with Monsignor is that as good a listener as he was, he, as a person in dialogue, he wasn't shy about speaking, and he spoke with a very robust basis in an idea that faith and reason were ways of knowing the world. And it wasn't just that he listened and whatever anyone said. He, as you say, in that cocktail party, he risked a lot to speak his mind and say, I'm sad that this man is dead. He's gone. I miss him. Something's wrong with the universe, that death exists in it. And I'm going to tell you that I believe that. And that, of course, intrigued people rather than put them off. And they wanted to talk more deeply. What is this deeper Catholic tradition from which you speak? And I think that's what's so powerful. Here's just a short quote about dualism that I found really powerful from the book. He says, the culture is defined in terms of how we look at and experience reality. The real choice is between a dualism that separates the sacred and the secular, the flesh and the spirit, and a unified incarnational vision. All of this is sustained by the grace of the encounter with Christ. It's unexpected, but it isn't a purely mental operation or purely spiritual. It occurs through someone in a given place at a given time. Fidelity to that particularity is essential because that, keeps us within the orbit of the encounter, sustaining our approach to the real. And here's the part that I really love. Christians are not here to show a specifically Catholic genius or to engage in a battle. We are here to give witness to our faith, yes, but also to really live with the confidence that that same faith gives us to understand what is real, what is being seen, what is being lived. Again, this awakens interest, and with interest, light. This is the only way.
I love that. I think that's from the talk, or from the essay, Everything is Grace, right? And I, that draws there, Monsignor was drawing on that beautiful quote from Saint Therese from her last conversations, right? Everything is grace. The same quote that Bernanos picks up in the Diary of a Country Priest. He puts it in the mouth of the dying priest, everything is grace. And that's another way into the whole the whole problematic of dualism that you were talking about, because, you know, here Monsignor emphasizes that Christianity is a gift, right? The encounter that we, you know, what makes Christians different from non-Christians? It's not that we have a better, well, you know, we do have a great set of rules, I guess I would say, but it's not primarily our set of rules. It's what's different is that we've had an encounter with the person of Jesus Christ, right? Which is an unmerited, a gratuitous encounter. Something has come, someone has happened to us. And that's what Christians bring into the world, right? It's not primarily, I mean, this is the challenge, right? Is of what we're tempted to do is to think that what we bring is a certain set of rules, a certain set of guidelines, but what we bring is the person of Jesus Christ. Now, of course, a lot of things flow from that, but to start with Christ gives a totally different approach to our encounters with others, right? To the conversations that you were talking about, Your Eminence. I mean, that's really where Monsignor always started.
Yes, and in today's world, where for so many science comes to replace religion, Lorenzo understood that, you know, as Saint Anselm says, that it's fides querens intellectum, intellectus queres fide. Faith is seeking to achieve understanding, and understanding helps to lead us to the faith. And his background in science, combined with his deep theological reflection, made him a wonderful apostle for people in today's world that under the influence of secularism are looking to science for answers to the ultimate questions, and those we need to look to the stars to find those answers.
Right.
I wonder if I can jump in here, or Greg, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that one of the things that corresponded to his personality, but that Giussani really helped him to fully articulate, was a critique of what he called what has been called moralism. Moralism is precisely this idea that you put, you know, the rules first, and that our ability to follow the rules is what sets us above others, or becomes the basis of our critique of others. The sort of restless driving, you know, need to put your case that others are wrong and we are right, that others behave badly and we behave well, that I think he understood was really a deeply unchristian way of, and that's not to say that these things don't matter. They do. He cared about morality deeply, but starting from Giussani, what he felt most deeply was that morality comes from a living relationship with another, right? That morality, the source of morality is my honoring of a relationship I have to someone else, doing right by them, caring for them, caring for my encounter with this other. And in that sense, if the living relationship, if that encounter is not foremost in my mind, then I'm not going to be interested in behaving rightly. So it wasn't that he had, again, no that morality was an empty category for him, not at all. He believed that it was a matter of priority and the centrality of a lived faith, out of which this grew, and which corresponded to the great complex edifices, as Cardinal Seán said to us, of the Catholic intellectual tradition, that those dovetail together. But if they weren't growing out of a lived experience, then they become nothing more than a tribalistic, a party in which one party is constantly driven by the need to defeat the other party at the polls. And that is not the faith. That is not how the faith grows and catches on and renews both church and culture.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'm just thinking as you speak, Greg, I think of Father Benedict, Pope Benedict XVI, and he said we can't reduce Christianity to some program in ethics when it's an encounter with the living God. I think we'd agree, this is in the program, so Cardinal Seán as well, we need to luxuriate in the honey baritone of Lorenzo Albacete. And so we have a clip here. It's not from the famous debate with Christopher Hitchens, which is a great one. And in that debate, he totally disarms Hitchens. If you watch it, he disarms Hitchens for all the reasons that you three are citing. He enters into a relationship with him, and Hitchens doesn't know what to do because he almost, it doesn't beat him with his own stick, but it's rhetorically interesting to watch that debate. And I just recommend watching Albacete. I'm going to show you why. Here's a 5-minute clip. It won't seem long, but it takes us deeper into your questions, you three. And I think it'll spring us back into commentary, response, and then we'll get some of our listeners in as well. So I'm going to share a screen. As they say, I'm going to do my clicks. That's all good. Technology is working. And here he is, Monsignor Albacete.
For that reason, because of that, I want to know, is there a way, a reasonable method by which I can verify the claims of the religious experience, of a religious contribution, if I'm trying to find the minimalist language possible, religious contribution to the way I see life and live it. And I believe that there better be, because if there isn't, then I am completely uninterested in the subject. How might one do that? What we really have to do, I believe, and in this I am entirely dependent to a man, the founder of the movement that I follow and that I'm more or less, I don't know what the heck I really am, concerning the movement in the United States. It's a book called The Religious Sense by Father Luigi Giussani. In so many ways, God at the Ritz is the total vulgarization of the religious sense. If you want a more serious, more presentation of what is here, which quotes Monty Python and everybody and Broadway shows, because I don't know Italian poets. Here, Dante, and that's the kind of it's amazing, good stuff, Rilke, all of that material. But here in my book, I try to bring it down to my humble level. The question is, there is me, and there is reality out there. What we need to investigate, I believe, and this is very important because a discussion about this is already a dialogue between people of faith and people who do not have faith, but both who are willing to submit to a reasonable analysis and evidence, something claimed to be evidence. What is claimed to be evidence here, what I think we should all look at, is our spontaneous reaction to reality. Better, to investigate the structure at all levels, the structure of the human reaction to reality. The unleashing of the question about why, and not only why, but what next, the unleashing of reason itself, ground zero. And to observe oneself when that happens. Most of the time, we have lost the purity of such a moment, but it's there. I remember, and mentioned in my book, a cartoon in the New Yorker, in which this lady and her husband, very, very type New Yorker cartoon, New York resident people, are bringing the little baby out of the hospital, newborn, born a few days, going back home in any case, and the taxis and the buildings and the canyons of Manhattan, everything are there, and then the little baby is there, and then the lady says, Harry, look, Harry, the world. That had this great impact on me. Suppose Harry could see or think or anything. What would have been his initial reaction when the world impacted him? His initial, zero, before anything starts. And Monsignor Giussani in his book talks about a mental experiment. Suppose you could go back into the womb and come out having, however, your awareness, the way your consciousness of yourself that you have now, but not having had the experience of anything else but you. What would be your first reaction? Now this is, again, you make a claim and the other person say, no, I don't think so, etc. To me, I am satisfied because, again, I could confirm it by even looking at that cartoon, that the immediate reaction is surprise, awe, marvel, wonder. Oh, look, Harry, the world. She herself was communicating that experience to Harry. Again, Harry had no idea what was going on. But had he been able to see, he would have marveled, wonder, stupor. All of these are words that resonate in what I'm trying to explain. I have them here. Stupefaction, to be overcome by wonder, to be invaded by wonder, to grasp reality as an event. That is, it's not just there, it has touched you, it has attempted to initiate, or you want to initiate a dialogue with it, an event, a presence, a marvel, something totally given to you. You are not, one thing is clear, you are not the author of that. Whatever that is and whatever it's coming from, before you begin classifying it or doing anything, you are not its author. So it's you run into it. So the original activity, if you wish, is in fact a form of passivity. It's a receiving, a taking note of, a recognizing. It is to become aware of an inexorable presence that attracts, but which is always beyond and always other, the radical otherness of it. But yet, it is a radical otherness that attracts, that is tempting me, like it's seducing me, you see. And that launches one. The important thing is not to stop, to continue pursuing that experience, to see where it goes.
What do you think?
That was a really well-chosen clip, I have to say. That was excellent editing on your part, because that was jam-packed.
I feel that Monsignor Albacete is kind of part of our conversation. That was, yeah, thank you.
That was a vintage Lorenzo.
Yeah, that was at Columbia in 2011. You know, Greg, you know, the Levertov, the wonder that there's anything at all. Something like that.
Yes, absolutely. The givenness of our life, the awareness of being born, where Slant's actually publishing a book by Giussani. It's a dialogue book with another thinker coming out next month called The Meaning of Birth. And that kind of existential awareness, that sense of you know, it goes back to Aristotle, of course. All learning begins with wonder. And this is not touchy-feely, right? These are fundamentally human experiences that we forget when we get more and more abstract. We abstract and abstract. Everything becomes an ideological system. But this was Monsignor's gift, was bringing us back to our experience. What is it? How do we live? How he would say, you know, following Giussani, observe yourself in action. And that's a challenge. It's very easy to forget. It's easier to try to just think the correct thoughts and do the correct things, but you're not living a life. and you have no desire to do those things because you're not connected to this origin, this source of yourself that he so beautifully points out here.
I love the whole, I mean, what I really love about that is it highlights the idea of wonder and this, like he even used that word stupefaction in front of reality. It just seems to me that, you know, when we were talking about what to name this book, Greg made a strong case for the relevance of the stars, which is what we came up with. And, you know, people will ask me, well, what are the stars, right? Why the stars? And the point is, you know, there's this great classic story from Giussani. He was, you know, walking one night and he comes upon two young lovers making out in a car, and he goes right up to them in full cassock and taps them on the shoulder and says, hey, do you know, what you're doing right now, what does it have to do with the stars? And the thing is that I love about that story, and it really expresses what we love about Monsignor Albacete, is that in front of this encounter of these two young lovers, there's wonder in front of their desire for, you know, their love for each other, their passion, but then always to go deeper, like, what does this open up? What does this open you up to, this experience in the world? So in every human experience, there's something given, and that givenness is something that we can, that is ultimately going to open us up to the ultimate reality, the mystery, the infinite. But to live in wonder in front of all of these experiences, that was Monsignor to a T. You couldn't be around him and not have your eyes be opened to something new.
Great. Panelists, treasured guests, we have questions now. I want to ask, we had a book club, Relevance of the Stars at Loyola, and students and graduate students and a couple of faculty. And we've asked a student to enter into our conversation. That's Emma Mitchell, who's a senior. So can we unmute Emma? And Emma, welcome to the party, to the Albacete party. And we'd love to hear what you think.
Hi, everyone. First, I'd just like to say thank you to all of you. As someone who would not have heard of Monsignor Albacete if it wasn't for this book and this Zoom call and the reading group that I get to be in, I'm very grateful that you're all here and sharing him and his work. A question that I was wondering, I guess I have two questions that you guys can choose which one you would like to answer. One of them is, in terms of editing the book, is there any idea of Albacete's or any characteristic of him that you feel you maybe weren't able to communicate as well as you would have wished, or anything that you wish you could have included in the book that you weren't able to do to your satisfaction? And then another question, just in the spirit of encounter and personal encounter, if you guys could share any other anecdotes of Albacete, particularly ones that offer you a lot of hope. I found that his ideas are very comforting and kind of encouraging almost, and just their faith in what is real and what can be known and recognized, and just the security in that. So I found Albacete's ideas to be, very, very comforting and encouraging in that way. So if you guys have any particularly comforting or hope-giving ideas of Albacete that you would like to share with all of us, I'm sure we would all like to hear them a lot. Thank you.
I'm happy to jump in on the question about the editing. Thank you so much, Emma. I have to tell you, you're completely inspiring me. When I saw in the email earlier that there was an Albacete book club, I was super excited about that, and super excited that you're here. I would say for me, I'm sure Greg has his own answer, because we had to do, as he pointed out, we had to do a fair amount of editing with this work, because Monsignor never, he never did he was brilliant, but he didn't take time to polish his own writing for publication. And so we were always working as editors. And I would say the thing that I wish we could have put more in is his humor. I really feel that there, I would just encourage people to watch the YouTube videos. That video we just watched was amazing because you encounter his depth of thought. But he is wickedly funny, and I think he's one of these people for whom humor was not just it wasn't just making a joke to put people at ease. It was literally a way to be with you, to be with others, and to be his full human self. So he was, as you could see in that little clip, the jokes were, he was often the butt of his own jokes. And I think it was just very characteristic of his humility and his humanity. So that would be, I wish we could have gotten more of that in the book. What do you think, Greg?
Here's a little flavor of the humor. At one point, he's talking about the relationship between, again, morality and faith, morality and life. And he says, I have an example to share with you. He says, I have a friend in Italy who is a crook, a thief. He is retired now, but on occasion he works as a consultant, an expensive one at that, with stores seeking to update their security systems. He really was an excellent crook. No jewelry store was safe from his exceptional talent. On one occasion, though, he was unable to do his work. He and his companions were already inside the store when suddenly he saw an image of the Blessed Virgin Mary. He immediately canceled the robbery. His accomplices were amazed. Are you afraid of a statue? They asked him. No, he said. It's the Blessed Virgin, La Madonna, my mother. How can I be afraid of her? Then why are you calling off the job? They asked. He explained, because tomorrow, when the robbery is discovered, people will say she was unable to protect them. And so they went and robbed another store. And this is this is an anecdote that he tells precisely to say, in terms of morality, true morality versus moralism, that morality stems not from the fact that we behave better than others or we live up to even our own moral rules, but morality, the source of morality is that something has been given to us. The source of morality is our gratitude and wonder at the gift of faith, a gift of salvation that Christ brings us. And it's that, as he puts it in the clip, the passivity or the reception of what has been given that is the sort of foundation, the cornerstone of all true morality, and not that we score a higher percentage than other people. Because he says, if that's the criterion, then we're really screwed.
You have a thought, Cardinal Seán?
I was just thinking of the video that was presented on the Albacete Hour or whatever it was called at the end, where the child asks him, why did God make dinosaurs? I thought that Lorenzo, it was once again vintage Albacete, the response, and he uses this as an indication to a proof of God's superabundant love for the Son, and the incarnational aspects of it are so important. But he was, and this was just a spontaneous response to the child, but it was just filled with such great theology and wisdom. But typical Lorenzo.
Yeah, thinking more about that all kind of compiles together, but I for some reason associate G.K. Chesterton to a point with Lorenzo, because their GKC finishes orthodoxy with the great secret of Jesus was his mirth. And, Albacete, Monsignor, another line by Chesterton is that funny is not the opposite of serious. It's the opposite of not funny. And so, you can get a lot of mileage out of that. But let me just throw another question now. We have many in advance. There was a lot of questions in advance about Albacete being a voice to overcome polarization. And so I think we've hit those topics. There are other questions about people want to hear anecdotes about all the friendships that Albacete had with Commonweal editor David Tulin, with other friends around town, of course, Charlie Rose and Bill Moyers, the PBS crowd who loved him so dearly. So there's that. There's also a question, though, about what would Albacete, what's his view on something like an important issue in the church, women and their roles in the church? Anybody have a thought on that?
I'm a woman, so I'll jump in. I have to tell you that I was a student under Monsignor Albacete at the John Paul II Institute, which was at the time in the Dominican House of Studies. So we had a handful of female students and a lot of young seminarians and young theology graduate students. And I experienced Monsignor Albacete as being absolutely encouraging of my own personal path, studying theology. I think that he was a student, he was an adherent of Pope John Paul II. I would say, the amazing and beautiful things that are said in Mulieris Dignitatem about the dignity of women, their capacity to bring a way of interacting with persons into the world and being leaders in the way of witnessing to self-giving love. I would say he was all behind all of that in the most profound theological way, but also was personally encouraging of my own path.
Thank you, Lisa. Anybody else want to weigh in on that very important issue?
I would just say Lorenzo had many very deep friendships with women that were very life-giving for him. And I think, there was nothing machista about his attitude towards women. It was the farthest, that kind of an attitude just did not exist in him. I think there's a danger of stressing too much Lorenzo's sense of humor, because it's not just a matter of fun. He was a joyful person, and that joy, even in the midst of great suffering and challenges and health problems and financial problems and losing jobs and all these other things, his faith allowed him to know how beloved he is to God, and that made him a joyful person. And when we read about the joy of the gospel, this is the way that the gospel is spread, not by good humor, but by having that joy that comes from a relationship with God and a deep awareness of how much our God loves us, as Benedict puts in the encyclical, quoting St. John's, we've come to discover God's love. And Lorenzo discovered that, and beginning with the great love that he received from his family, and that love transformed him and made him a joyful person, even in the midst of a valley of tears.
Thank you, Cardinal Seán. That's beautifully put. Gregory.
Just going to say, he was irreverent in the way that only somebody with deep reverence can be. That sense again of the serious and the hilarious, that is an incarnational, this is the word that I just keep coming back to. It's an incarnational vision. And, this was a movement thing, so he could probably be excused a little bit from departing from the theological norm, but he ended the Mass. He said, the Mass is ended. Bye. And just the freedom that he had. I mean, so many of us operate under a feeling of constant constraint. How do people look at us, and am I doing the right thing? And he was just blissfully free of that. He didn't draw boundaries where we are socially expected to. I mean, he had a sibling, for example, with severe mental and emotional challenges, and when that sibling called him, he would always take the call. And in fact, one of the times that I witnessed, he was speaking in front of an audience of, I think, 500 people, and his phone rang, and it was his sibling, and he picked up the phone and he carried on a conversation in the middle of the talk. And I just, the charity of that, the boldness of the kind of freedom of that, to me speaks of a world of, that's the tip of the iceberg. That huge element underground is all the theological, intellectual Catholic tradition that's there. And yet, the point is, we see only the tip of the iceberg, and we only need to see the tip of the iceberg. It's going to exist when that ballast is there of everything. But it's this beautiful, thing that we encounter that enchants us and inflames us and attracts us, and that's what he was able to reflect so beautifully.
And I always enjoyed it when people asked him, what is communion liberation? And he would respond, it's Opus Dei for bad people.
Well, Cardinal Seán, back to your joy observation. It's wonderful. It's very, it seems to me, maybe a short trip, but very Franciscan to say that. Giving St. Francis, I think they had the real gift of joy. And the freedom that Pope Francis has, he's another very free person. That was remarkable in his papacy. We're moving to the end here. We want to allow time for prayer. But I just want to note a couple things. I want to thank people for their questions. Stephen John Fogel's question, and then Ernest Rubenstein, forgive me, also has a question, which I'll get to in a second. But I do want to put a light on Olivetta Donesi, who works with the New York Encounter, and she texted me the Albacete Forum link, where you can watch a beautiful 1-hour video of Monsignor Albacete, and we encourage you to do so. But here's our last question. It's maybe just a quick comment, and then Lisa, we want to hear from you. What about the role of doubt in this? There's joy in Monsignor. Was there any doubt? And what role does that play in a life of faith?
That's a really intense question. The thing is about Monsignor Albacete was he lived a full humanity, and doubt is part of our full humanity. And there was absolutely nothing. My impression as an impressionable young theology student. So I met him when I was 21 years old, sitting in his class, and maybe even the first class was a man who lived the full spectrum of humanity. So we saw him joyful, we saw him funny, we saw him, like you were just saying, Greg, unhappy, challenged, uncertain, and it was all there. And I think the thing about Monsignor was that it was all open to Christ. It was no holds barred Christianity when you were with him, and that was what was so attractive.
And we could also do an entire session just based on the amazing providential gift of his being present at when 9/11 happened, which he later, formalized when Helen Whitney made a documentary about faith and doubt at Ground Zero, which is an amazing program. And Albacete is in some ways the beating heart of that. And his willingness to be completely unguarded, not only about his grief and the doubt that this kind of evil and destruction, causes us to feel, but in a sense, even more than that, his sense that he recognized a kinship with the bombers, the suicide, plane people, and he said, "This is religion. This is at least an aspect of religion that I recognize in myself, the danger of an absolutism, of an ideology that nonetheless has some kind of deep connection to what I hold most dear. It may be a corruption of it, but I recognize it and I sense a kinship. And this causes me to take it even more seriously and not to stigmatize these people and to try to understand how something good can become evil. He was present and a consoling voice precisely because of that absolute honesty, at a time of absolute national and existential catastrophe.
Thank you so much, Greg. That's wonderfully put as well. Really, really important. Something to think about for sure. Lisa and Greg, thanks for your book. Congratulations. Cardinal Seán, we'll give you the last word, and I would request, and I really appreciate you taking us out with prayer. Thank you very much, Cardinal.
Thank you, Michael. And I want to thank all of you for bringing us together tonight and giving us this opportunity to reflect on this wonderful book that, if it had not been for your efforts and determination, would never have come to light. But you have allowed us to be able to glimpse once more this great astronomer of the stars, and our dear friend Lorenzo. I'm sure that he is praying for all of us as we talk about him here tonight, and I would encourage those who have not read his books to please do so. And I'm glad that you brought up the possibility of people seeing that wonderful video on the Albacete forum. If people have not had the opportunity to know Lorenzo personally, it's an opportunity to catch a glimpse of his extraordinary gifts of personality, of intellect, and of spirituality. And now let us ask for God's blessing. O God, Trinity of love, from the profound communion of your divine life, pour out upon us a torrent of love. Inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world, a world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. Grant us the love reflected in the actions of Jesus and his family of Nazareth and in the early Christian community. Grant that we Christians may live the gospel, discovering Christ in each human being, recognizing him crucified in the sufferings of the abandoned and forgotten of our world, and risen in each brother or sister who makes a new start. Come, Holy Spirit, show us your beauty, reflected in all the peoples of the earth, so that we may discover anew that all are important and all are necessary, different faces of the one humanity that God so loves. And this we ask in Jesus' holy name. Amen.
Thank you, Your Eminence. And
Thank all
you.
of you. God
yes.
bless.
Thanks, Greg Wolfe. Thanks, Lisa Lickona, so much. Good night.
You.
Good night,
Good
viewers,
night.
and God bless everybody. And happy Thanksgiving, one and all.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Bless you.
you.